Budapest, October 1944. The city is caught between two collapsing worlds. Soviet forces are encircling the Hungarian capital from the east, their artillery audible in the suburbs on clear nights. The Arrow Cross, Hungary's fascist regime, clings to power with a kind of desperation that breeds violence. German troops occupy key positions, Wehrmacht units mingling with SS detachments overseeing what remains of the deportations. The Hungarian government exists in name only, a puppet administration dancing to two masters who are themselves at war. In a requisition office building on Andersey Avenue, Hungarian military intelligence continues its work, though the meaning of that work grows less clear by the day. Officers sort through files, monitoring communications, tracking movements that may no longer matter. Some are preparing to flee. Others are destroying records. A few are doing both. Among them was Major Istvan Kovacs. Kovacs wasn't a name the public knew. No photographs and propaganda materials, no speeches, no decorations displayed at state ceremonies. He was Section 2B, Counterintelligence Operations, attached to Hungarian Second Army's intelligence apparatus. Born 1909 in Debrecen. Law degree from Pécs University, 1932. Recruited into military intelligence in 1936. Fluent in German, Russian, and Serbian. His personnel file, recovered decades later from fragmentary Hungarian military archives, describe him as exceptionally capable, politically pragmatic, methodologically rigorous. By October 1944, Kovacs was managing a network of informants monitoring Soviet military movements and partisan activities in occupied territories. His role was liaison between Hungarian intelligence and their German counterparts, coordinating information exchange about Red Army capabilities, communist underground networks, potential defectors, technical work, administrative coordination, the kind of position that kept intelligence services functioning but left no dramatic operational footprint, no stories worth telling. On October 15, 1944, Hungary's regent, Admiral Miklos Horthy, announced a secret armistice with the Soviet Union in a radio broadcast that stunned the nation. Within hours, the announcement was nullified by a German-backed coup. Arrow Cross forces, supported by SS units, seized control of Budapest. Horthy was arrested. The brief attempt at switching sides collapsed into chaos and bloodshed. On October 16th at 14:30 hours, Kovacs sent a coded message to Hungarian intelligence headquarters, now operating under German supervision. The cable, discovered years later in Soviet military archives captured from East German facilities during reunification, contained routine intelligence assessments about Soviet troop concentrations near the city's eastern approaches. Standard reporting. Nothing unusual. The message was logged. The duty officer initialed the receipt. Standard procedure. At 19:45 that same evening, Kovacs was scheduled to attend a coordination meeting with German WWII officers at their field headquarters near the Castle District. He never arrived. A German report filed 2 days later noted his absence and requested information about his whereabouts from Hungarian authorities. The Hungarian response, dated October 20th, stated simply, Major Kovacs assigned to special duties. Further inquiries should be directed to appropriate authorities. No explanation of which authorities. No clarification of what special duties meant in the middle of a coup, a siege, an advancing Soviet army. 3 days later, Soviet forces captured a German intelligence post on the city's outskirts. Among the documents they seized was an Arrow Cross internal memo dated October 18th, listing military intelligence personnel to be detained for unreliable loyalty and suspected contact with Bolshevik elements. Kovacs' name appeared third on the list, underlined twice, but there was no record of his arrest, no detention order, no interrogation transcript, no execution notice. On October 22nd, a Soviet NKVD unit conducting operations behind German lines filed a brief report noting the reception of valuable intelligence material from Hungarian source, codenamed Gemini, regarding German defensive positions and Arrow Cross leadership locations. The report mentioned no names, no biographical details, just a code name and a notation that the source had been extracted to secure location for debriefing. 6 weeks later, In early December 1944, as Soviet forces tightened their siege of Budapest, a British intelligence liaison in Moscow sent a cable to London referencing Hungarian intelligence officer, formerly Section 2B, currently providing detailed assessments of Axis communication security and Hungarian military structure. The cable requested authorization to share certain information with American counterparts. The authorization was granted. The cable was filed. The name Kovacs appeared nowhere in the document. And then silence. When Budapest finally fell to Soviet forces in February 1945, after a brutal siege that left the city in ruins and tens of thousands dead, Hungarian military intelligence records were either destroyed, captured by the Soviets, or seized by fleeing Germans. What remained was fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete, useful only for reconstructing the outline of what had been, never the details. Kovacs's personnel file showed no entry after October 15, 1944. His last recorded duty assignment ended the day Horthy announced the armistice. His fate was listed in post-war Hungarian military records as unknown, presumed killed during siege of Budapest, 1944 to 1945. But there was no body, no death certificate, no witness testimony placing him in the city during the final battle. No grave. Hungarian authorities compiling post-war casualty lists in 1946 marked his file unverified, insufficient evidence of death. The notation was routine, applied to thousands of missing persons whose fates would never be confirmed. But in Kovacs's case, the absence was different, the silence was deeper, and it would last for 81 years. If you're enjoying the story, please subscribe to support the channel. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Hungary fell under Soviet occupation and communist control. The new government conducted extensive purges of former military and intelligence personnel, particularly those who had collaborated with the Germans or the Arrow Cross regime. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, tried in show trials, or simply disappeared into the Soviet Gulag system. The purges were thorough, methodical, and well documented. Major Istvan Kovacs's name appeared on none of the arrest lists. Not the Hungarian Communist Security Service's detention rosters, not the Soviet NKVD's deportation logs, not the war crimes investigation files compiled by Hungarian prosecutors seeking to demonstrate loyalty to the new Soviet-backed order. In 1947, a Hungarian government commission investigating wartime collaboration requested information about Kovacs from Soviet military authorities, who controlled access to captured Hungarian intelligence archives stored in Moscow. They wanted to know whether he had participated in deportations, intelligence operations against partisans, or coordination with German security services that might constitute war crimes. The Soviet response, delivered through official diplomatic channels 3 months later, stated simply, subject Istvan Kovacs, former Hungarian intelligence, no current information available. File not located in captured archives. The commission noted the response and closed the inquiry. Kovacs was classified as deceased, circumstances unknown. His wife and 2 children received no military pension, no survivor benefits, nothing that would have drawn attention to his case or his disappearance. In 1952, the researcher working for the newly formed West German Intelligence Service was compiling biographical information on former Hungarian military personnel who might have valuable knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations in Eastern Europe. While cross-referencing displaced persons' records in the chaotic post-war years, he found an entry for an Istvan Kovacs, born 1909 Debrecen, listed as having departed Vienna for Canada in 1948 on a refugee visa. But the documentation was incomplete. No photograph in the file. No fingerprints. No forwarding address. The sponsoring organization was listed as a Catholic relief agency that had been active in helping Eastern European refugees. But when contacted through intermediaries, they had no record processing anyone matching Kovacs's details. Canadian immigration authorities, when queried through official diplomatic channels, reported no record of an Istvan Kovacs matching the birth year and origin entering the country in 1948. The trail ended in Vienna, in bureaucratic limbo, in the gap between one record system and another. The West German researcher flagged the discrepancy in his report, but received instructions not to pursue it further. The matter was classified and archived. No explanation given. No justification provided. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, Western intelligence services scrambled to gather information about Hungarian military and intelligence structures. The CIA compiled detailed dossiers on former Hungarian officers who might provide valuable insights into Soviet occupation methods, communist security apparatus, or potential vulnerabilities in the Eastern Bloc. A research analyst at CIA headquarters submitted a routine request for information about István Kovács, noting that fragmentary wartime records suggested he had held a position that would have given him access to Soviet intelligence procedures during and after the war. The request was routed through multiple departments. After 6 weeks, it returned with a stamp. Information classified under separate program. Access restricted. No further inquiry authorized. The analyst, frustrated but accustomed to bureaucratic barriers in intelligence work, noted the denial in his research files and moved on other subjects. What he didn't know was that his request had triggered an internal review at the highest levels of the CIA's Soviet Operations Division. An internal memo, declassified only in 2023, shows that the Director of Operations personally reviewed the inquiry and determined that continued classification of materials related to Gemini operations serves ongoing security interests and protects sensitive sources and methods from potential compromise. Gemini, the same code name that had appeared in the 1944 Soviet NKVD report. Over the decades, fragments of information emerged from different sources, each adding confusion rather than clarity, each suggesting something without confirming anything. A former Hungarian intelligence officer who had defected to the West in 1956 during the Revolution mentioned in a debriefing that he had heard rumors during the war of a Section 2B officer who had gone over to the Soviets in October 1944. He couldn't remember the name with certainty, but thought it might have been Kovács or something similar. When asked for more details, he said the story was whispered, never confirmed, and that anyone who knew more had either died in the siege or disappeared into Soviet camps. A British intelligence report from 1960, discovered in archives decades later, referenced a former Hungarian intelligence asset, currently under protection, who provided valuable intelligence during transition period 1944 to 1947. The report recommended continued maintenance of cover arrangements, but provided no names, no locations, no operational details beyond a vague acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, remained protected. A Soviet intelligence document, obtained by Western services during the 1970s through a defector, mentioned Gemini in a list of successful wartime intelligence operations, but provided no biographical information about the source beyond noting that cooperation had begun prior to Budapest liberation. The document was filed, analyzed, and archived. The code name remained just that, a code, a mystery, a placeholder for a story no one could tell. By the 1970s, historians researching Hungarian military intelligence operations occasionally encounter Kovács's name in footnotes and marginalia of captured documents. He was always described the same way. Section 2B officer, fate unknown after October 1944, presumed killed during siege. Some assumed he had been killed during the chaos of the Aerocross coup. Others speculated he had been arrested and executed by the Soviets, like so many other Hungarian officers whose expertise made them valuable but whose allegiances made them dangerous. A few noted the unusual absence of any confirmation of death and wondered if he might have escaped to the West under a false identity, another refugee in a continent full of displaced persons. But the complete absence of any documentary evidence was strange. Even officers who died in the siege usually left some trace: witness testimony, mass grave records, family inquiries, claims for pensions or benefits. Kovács left nothing, just a name in personnel rosters that ended abruptly on October 15, 1944, and a silence that stretched across decades. The silence wasn't random. It was too complete, too consistent across too many archives controlled by different governments with different interests. Records that should have existed didn't. Inquiries were blocked or deflected with bureaucratic language that meant nothing and everything. Files remained classified decades after the events they documented, long after any reasonable security concern should have expired. It was a kind of silence that required coordination, maintenance, Institutional memory passed down through generations of archivists and intelligence officers. The kind of silence that suggested not forgetting, but active, deliberate management. Dr. Anna Molnar was researching Hungarian intelligence operations during the final year of World War II, focusing on the chaotic period when Hungary attempted to switch sides and escape German occupation. A historian at Yavuz University in Budapest, she had spent years working through fragmentary archives, cross-referencing Hungarian, Soviet, German, and Western intelligence documents, try to reconstruct what happened during those desperate months in 1944 and 1945. It was meticulous work, the kind that required patience and an acceptance that most questions would never be fully answered. Hungarian military intelligence records from 1944 to 1945 were scattered across multiple countries, held in archives with different classification systems, different access policies, different institutional cultures. The Soviets had captured most of them, later transferring some to East German and Hungarian communist archives. Others had been seized by fleeing Germans or destroyed during the siege. What survived was incomplete, contradictory, and heavily redacted even decades later. In 2019, while researching at the Hungarian National Archives, Molnar discovered a small collection of documents that had been reclassified and made available to researchers only the year before. Most were routine supply requisitions, personnel transfers, administrative correspondence. But one file caught her attention. It was a Soviet NKVD operational summary from November 1944, originally captured by Western intelligence during the Cold War and recently returned to Hungarian archives as part of a cultural exchange agreement. The document discussed intelligence collection operations during the Budapest siege, listing several sources by code name. Gemini was among them. The description read, Hungarian Military Intelligence Officer, Section 2B, recruited October 1944. Provided detailed intelligence on German defensive positions, Hungarian military structure, and Axis communication security. High-value source. Extraction completed October 22nd. Currently in secure location, undergoing extended debriefing. The reference to extraction suggested Western involvement. Soviet forces in October 1944 were still fighting their way toward Budapest, not running sophisticated extraction operations inside enemy-held cities. Molnar requested corresponding files from British intelligence archives, working through academic channels and official research agreements. After 2 years of bureaucratic delays, she received a partial release. Most pages were still heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out, but fragments remained visible. A cable from British military intelligence in Moscow to London, dated November 1944, discuss Hungarian intelligence officer extracted by Soviet services with British liaison support, October 1944. The cable noted that the source had been providing intelligence through indirect channels since August 1944, before the extraction. August, 2 months before Horthy's armistice announcement, 2 months before the Arrow Cross coup, 2 months before the chaos that had provided cover for so many disappearances. Another document, a joint British-Soviet intelligence assessment from January 1945, referenced Gemini continues to provide valuable strategic intelligence on Hungarian military capabilities and German occupation structures. Recommend continued protection and consideration for post-war utilization. Post-war utilization. The phrase suggested planning that extended beyond immediate wartime needs, beyond the question of who would win, and into the question of what would come after. The breakthrough came in 2025, when the CIA released another batch of Cold War-era documents following a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that had been working through the courts for 7 years. Buried in routine operational correspondence was a 1954 memo discussing the status of former Axis intelligence personnel currently under protection or employment arrangements. One section, partially redacted with key details still blacked out, read, Gemini, Istvan Kovacs, former Hungarian military intelligence, continues to provide valuable analysis of Soviet intelligence procedures and Hungarian security service structures. Subject relocated to redacted in 1949 under agreed cover arrangement with British services. Current employment, redacted. Security classification, protected asset, recommend continued maintenance of cover status and non-disclosure of wartime cooperation. The memo confirmed what Molnar had begun to suspect from the fragments scattered across archives. Kovacs hadn't died in Budapest. He hadn't been executed by the Soviets or killed during the siege. He had been extracted, protected, and employed by Western intelligence services for at least a decade after the war, possibly longer. But when had his cooperation actually begun? The August 1944 reference suggested he had been providing intelligence months before his extraction, while still serving as an active Hungarian intelligence officer, still coordinating with German counterparts, still maintaining his official position in a regime allied with the Axis. Molnar assembled the fragments methodically, building a timeline from contradictory evidence and partial documentation. In August 1944, as Soviet forces approached Hungary and Horthy's government began secret negotiations for an armistice, someone in Hungarian intelligence had made contact with Soviet services. By October, when the armistice announcement triggered the German-backed coup, that someone, Kovacs, was already providing intelligence, already compromised, already marked for extraction. When the Arrow Cross regime marked him for arrest as a security risk, British and Soviet services coordinated an extraction operation. He was pulled out of Budapest on October 22nd, taken to Soviet-controlled territory, then later transferred to British custody. After the war, he was employed by Western intelligence services, providing analysis of Soviet and Hungarian intelligence operations throughout the early Cold War. His cooperation hadn't begun in defeat or desperation. It had begun months earlier, while he was still trusted, still useful, still in a position to betray everything he had access to. But crucial questions remained unanswered, protected by classification barriers that showed no sign of coming down. What had motivated his decision? Had he been ideologically opposed to the Arrow Cross and German occupation? Had he been recruited by Soviet services? Or had he approached them? And most importantly, what specific intelligence had he provided that made his extraction and protection worth the diplomatic and operational risk of coordinating between Allied powers who would soon be enemies? Molnar filed additional requests for declassification with British, American, and Russian intelligence agencies. The responses came slowly, and when they came, they were nearly identical. Additional materials related to subject Kovacs/Gemini remained classified under national security exemptions. No declassification date scheduled. In her research, Molnar found one more piece of evidence, overlooked in earlier reviews. A 1948 British Foreign Office memo discussing arrangements for former Hungarian intelligence assets requiring permanent resettlement outside Soviet sphere of influence. The memo was mostly administrative, budgets, cover stories, documentation requirements. But one paragraph mentioned that subject Gemini has been successfully relocated with appropriate documentation and employment cover. Family remains in Hungary, unaware of subject survival and current status. This arrangement continues to provide operational security and leverage should subject's cooperation waver. Family remains in Hungary. Kovacs had left behind a wife and 2 children when he was extracted in October 1944. Hungarian records showed they had been told he died during the siege. They received no military pension, no survivor benefits, nothing that would have drawn attention to his case or suggested he might have survived. They lived their entire lives believing he had died in 1945. His wife died in 1978, never knowing. His children, now elderly, still lived in Hungary. Their father, a faded memory from childhood, a man who had gone to work one day in October 1944 and never come home. Molnar contacted them in 2025, carefully, through official academic channels and with institutional support. They were shocked. They had no idea their father had survived the war. They had no knowledge of his intelligence work beyond his basic military service. They had spent 81 years mourning a man who had been alive, living under a new identity in a country they would never know, doing work they could never understand. When asked if they wanted to know where their father had lived after the war, or when he died, or what name he had used, they declined. Some truths, they said, came too late to matter. Some absences lasted too long to be filled by information. The truth about István Kovacs is no longer completely hidden. It exists in declassified documents, academic publications, and scattered archive files accessible to researchers with patience and institutional access. He switched sides in 1944, providing intelligence to Soviet and British services while still serving in Hungarian military intelligence. He was extracted, protected, and employed throughout the early Cold War. He lived somewhere under some name until his death at an unknown date. But the full story remains sealed behind classification barriers that span multiple governments and intelligence agencies. The documents that would answer the crucial questions: what specific intelligence did he provide? How many operations did his information enable or compromise? Who else was part of the network that facilitated his extraction? Where did he live after 1949? When did he die? What name did he use? Those documents remain classified, protected by national security exemptions that have outlived everyone involved by decades. In 2025, a retired CIA officer, speaking anonymously to a journalist researching Cold War intelligence operations, said something revealing. The Kovacs case was always complicated, not because what he did was particularly sensitive. Plenty of people switched sides during the war, but because of what protecting him revealed about how the game was really played. The Soviets extracted him, but let us take custody. We employed him, but never told the Hungarians he survived. Everyone knew, but everyone stayed quiet because it served everyone's interests. Declassifying the full file would mean explaining why we kept that silence for so long. The officer refused to elaborate further. When pressed, he ended the conversation. Molnar's research revealed something beyond Kovacs's individual story. In the declassified files, she found references to at least 7 other Hungarian intelligence officers who had disappeared in October and November 1944, during the chaos of the Arrow Cross coup and the Soviet advance. Most were simply listed as fate unknown in post-war records, but buried in Soviet operational summaries and Western intelligence correspondence, she found code names that seemed to match the timing and circumstances. Orion, Persis, Cassiopeia. Each appeared in documents discussing intelligence collection during the Budapest operation. Each was described as a high-value source or protected asset. None were ever identified by real name in any declassified document. She filed requests for information about these code names. The responses stated that materials related to wartime intelligence operations in Hungary remain classified under agreements between successor governments and intelligence services. Classified, protected, sealed, 81 years after the events they documented. In 2025, Molnar received an anonymous email, no name, no return address, sent through an encrypted service that left no trace. The message was brief: you found one. There were others, not just Hungarians. The Budapest operation was a template. Look at other cities in autumn 1944. Look at who disappeared when regimes collapsed. The files exist. They're just not where you're looking. 81 years after Major Istvan Kovacs disappeared from his office in Budapest, his story is partially known. He switched sides in 1944, working with Soviet and British intelligence while still serving his official role. He was extracted, protected, and employed by Western services during the Cold War. He lived somewhere under a new identity until his death at an unknown date in an unknown place. His story was released in fragments, each declassification carefully timed and controlled. The agencies that once protected him decided when and how much of the protection would be revealed, but the files still reference code names without identities, operations without full documentation, networks that remain hidden behind classification walls that show no sign of coming down. Because the question was never just about Istvan Kovacs or the handful of other officers who switched sides in autumn 1944. It was about the systems that facilitated those switches, the agreements between enemies that allowed certain people to be extracted while others died, the networks that remained active long after the war ended, and whether those arrangements ever really ended or simply evolved, adapted, and continued operating in shadows we still can't see. The snow falls softly now over Budapest, over the building on Andersey Avenue where Kovacs once worked. No plaque marks what happened there. No monument stands for the man who vanished into protection. History records the battles, the occupations, the regime changes. But the smaller transactions, the individual bargains, the files sealed to protect not just secrets, but the systems that created those secrets, those remain hidden. Istvan Kovacs switched sides in World War II. 81 years later, part of the truth was declassified, but only part, and maybe that's all we were ever meant to see. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.